Hola, ¿qué tal? Welcome back to Classes with Professor Jason. In today's class, what I want to talk about are the dialects of Spanish. I want to talk a little bit about the question of whether the Spanish spoken in Spain is superior, better than the other regional varieties spoken around, for example, Latin America. It's a question I often get and a comment that's often made on my videos, okay? So let's talk a little bit about standard Spanish, Spanish from Spain, and the dialects of Spanish spoken around Latin America. Now, there are some 350 million native speakers of the Spanish language. They live in more than 20 countries and speak dozens of dialects, which are different regional and social varieties that may vary in diverse ways from standard Spanish. We'll get to that in a second. First of all, what's the difference between a dialect and a language? Well, linguists often answer this question by saying that dialects are varieties of speech that are mutually intelligible to their speakers, despite certain differences in pronunciation or accent, grammar, vocabulary, and so on. Languages, however, are so different that they cannot be mutually intelligible between their speakers. The varieties, for example, that became Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, French, and Romanian actually began as regional dialects of Latin that were somewhat mutually intelligible until they became so distinct that they're now classified as separate languages. Right? Now, I often hear people say that the language spoken in Mexico, for example, is not real Spanish. Or it's not even Spanish, it's Mexican. Now, this idea is pervasive but simply not true. Okay? The varieties or variants of Spanish spoken in Madrid, Mexico City, and La Paz or Buenos Aires are all dialects of the same language. In fact, aside from a few differences in pronunciation and the local usage of slang expressions, they're surprisingly similar to one another. So a person from Spain, one from Mexico, another from Bolivia or Argentina could in fact get together, have a long conversation, and without a doubt, each of them would understand virtually everything that was said, although they'd probably notice small, really minor differences in pronunciation, grammar, and of course vocabulary usage. Okay? That brings us to a second question, okay? And this addresses comments that I often get on my videos. Okay? Isn't the Spanish from Spain closer to the original and better than the dialects of Latin America? First of all, we have to understand that languages are constantly changing and evolving. Today's exceptions literally become tomorrow's rules. It's a process that no grammar teacher or even Spain's language enforcers at the Real Academia Española can hope to stop. Since even the Spanish spoken in Madrid has changed radically over the centuries, not even the Spanish can rightfully claim to speak a pure, virginal, unchanged version of their own language, assuming such a thing ever existed, right? So in short, all speakers of Spanish speak a dialect of the language, and there are even several distinct dialects within the Iberian Peninsula itself. Now, of course, there are also numerous dialects in Latin America that differ in various ways from the Spanish spoken in much of Spain, but that only makes them different, not inferior, okay? So I don't want to get any more comments about how Mexican or Chilean or Argentine Spanish is not Spanish. It's a dialect of Spanish that's different from the Spanish of Spain, but not worse, not inferior. Okay? The same can be said about Brazilian Portuguese or US or American English. They're simply different varieties, not better or worse than the Portuguese from Portugal or the English used in the UK. All right? Now, having said all this, it is in fact possible to speak of a more or less standard or normative dialect of Spanish, a collection of phonetic tendencies, grammar structures, and lexical items, words, that most speakers would consider to be correct or proper, and relatively free of conspicuous regional differences. Okay? I'm talking about the variety usually taught in schools, the one used in formal writing and speech situations, and preferred by speakers that for whatever reason avoid or resist non-standard or regional features. Okay? But the Spanish, this standard Spanish is not necessarily the same as Spanish from Spain. Okay? In other words, not all people in Spain speak standard Spanish. And standard Spanish is not only spoken in Spain. Okay? In Spain, you're going to hear just as many non-standard or regional features and slang as anywhere else throughout the Spanish-speaking world. Okay? On the other hand, standard Spanish is in fact spoken throughout the entire Spanish-speaking world. Right? It's used by educated speakers in Mexico, Honduras, the United States, Colombia, Paraguay, etc., and in Spain. By the same token, speakers from all of these countries and all the Spanish-speaking countries typically and on a regular basis use many non-standard and regional features. Okay, so there's a mix of standard, non-standard, regional Spanish. And one is not better, inherently superior than the others. They're just different. Okay, so let's all get along here on Professor Jason's channel. Now I'd like to move on and talk a little bit about some of the major differences or some of the key characteristics that define the distinctions between some of the varieties, not only between Peninsular and Latin American Spanish, but within Latin American Spanish varieties in particular, which are the ones I know a little bit more about. Okay? So the next part of the video I'm going to talk about some of these key differences. So stay tuned. Here we go. Alright, I'm going to begin this discussion by talking about one major difference in terms of pronunciation between Spanish or Peninsular Spanish and Latin American Spanish. It has to do with the pronunciation of the sound represented by the letters Z and C when C comes before the vowels E and I. In Spain, this Z and C are pronounced like the TH in the English word this, not as the S in sun. This phenomenon is called distinción. In Latin America, the Z, the C before E or I, and the S are all pronounced like the S in sun, and this is called ceseo. So, the Spanish pronunciation of the Z is similar to the TH in English. Okay? Some examples would be zapato, Lázaro, plaza, corazón, cazar. Okay? But in Latin America, these same words would be pronounced zapato, Lázaro, plaza, corazón, y cazar. So in Latin America, these two final words, cazar y cazar, are pronounced the same. In Spain, there would be distinción, cazar and cazar, or cazar, or as they might say in Spain, cazar. Okay? We're going to move on to the C when it comes before E and I, the same type of distinction. In Spain, its pronunciation is similar to the English TH in this, but in Latin America, it's pronounced as an S. So, for example, we have in Spain, merece, crecimiento, and Cecilia, whereas in Latin America, these would be merece, crecimiento, and Cecilia. Okay. The sound represented by the letter double L, right, can also vary by region. In some isolated parts of Spain and in Latin America as well, certain parts isolated, its pronunciation is similar to the double Li sequence in words like million. Okay, so in most of Latin America, it's pronounced like the Y in yes. So in those isolated regions, you might hear Guillermo or Calle, but in most of Spain and Latin America, it will be Guillermo and Calle. And we'll talk about some variations on that in the Buenos Aires or River Plate dialect in just a minute. Okay. Another characteristic of Latin American pronunciation is the softening or the loss of the D sound when it appears between vowels or at the end of words. So, for example, instead of los pescados, you might hear los pescados. Instead of no entiendo nada, you might hear no entiendo nada. Instead of ella se puso colorada, you might hear ella se puso colorada. Or la ciudad could become la ciudad. And this is not only in Spain, or not only in Latin America, rather, this could happen in Spain, in Andalusia, for example. Similarly, in Latin America, in some parts of Spain, the S sound when it comes at the end of a syllable or the end of a word is often aspirated or completely dropped. So instead of los viernes, you might hear los viernes. Instead of las dos casas, you might hear las dos casas. Instead of este miércoles, you may hear este miércoles. Instead of, for example, nos gustan los plátanos maduros, you could hear nos gustan los plátanos maduros. Okay, it just depends. All right, it's kind of a sliding scale. In some parts, the S's are very pronounced. Some parts of Mexico, for example, you might hear los viernes, las dos casas, este miércoles. And in some parts of the Caribbean, you hear los viernes, la dos casas, este miércoles. Okay, completely aspirated or elided. Moving on then, in the River Plate dialect spoken in Argentina and Uruguay, the sounds represented by the letters LL and doble L and Y, Y, can be pronounced in at least three different ways, like the Y in yes. So for example, ya no vivo en esa calle, ya no me llamo Guillermo, Yo no me llamo Guillermo. Ayer llovió mucho. They can also be pronounced like the S in pleasure. So, ya no vivo en esa calle. Yo no me llamo Guillermo. Ayer llovió mucho. Or more like the SH in the English word shoe. Ya no vivo en esa calle. Yo no me llamo Guillermo. Ayer llovió mucho. Okay? So you have different possibilities for the sound represented by those two letters. Okay? All right, moving on to another distinct characteristic. In Caribbean dialects, say for example, Puerto Rico, Cuba, La República Dominicana, you often hear an intensified velarization, which causes more nasalization of the N sound in specific contexts, specifically when it appears at the end of a syllable or word in three different contexts: immediately before a pause, before a vowel, or before another velar consonant, such as the hard K or G sounds. So I'm going to try this. I'm not Dominican, so it might not come out right, but you might hear something like, instead of él habla alemán, you might hear él habla alemán. Ellos no están aquí could be ellos no están aquí. Me gusta el pan caliente could be me gusta el pan caliente, pan caliente. Okay, so there's an intensified nasalization of that final N. Pan caliente, alemán, están aquí. Okay. Similarly, but particularly in Puerto Rico, many speakers pronounce the R sound at the end of a syllable or word like the L. Now, this isn't all speakers, but speakers of certain socioeconomic background, perhaps. Okay. So instead of me voy a afeitar esta barba, you could hear me voy a afeitar esta barba. Instead of los voy a llamar el martes, someone could say los voy a llamar el martes. Or los Yankees, because they're Yankee fans, los Yankees no van a perder. You could hear los Yankees no van a perder. Los Yankees no van a perder. Okay. And again, I don't imitate accents very well, so you have to bear with me and be patient. You can feel free to critique me in the comments. Alright, there are also certain differences in grammar. We've just been looking at differences in pronunciation, but what about grammatical differences? Differences, for example, in the morphology or the forms of words or verbs. Well, one major difference between the Spanish of Spain and that of Latin America that you may have heard of has to do with the pronouns and verb forms used for the second person plural address, like you all or you guys. In Spain, the vosotros form is widely used. You hear it everywhere. While in Latin America, it's almost never spoken or even written. Instead, the ustedes form is preferred, used almost exclusively. So you can see examples of that. In Spain, you would hear vosotros tenéis mucha suerte, whereas in Latin America, you would never hear that. It would be ustedes tienen mucha suerte. Okay? ¿A dónde vais esta noche in Spain? ¿A dónde van esta noche in Latin America? Command form, the imperative in Spain would be abrid vuestros libros, where it would be abran sus libros in Latin America. Or a negative command using the subjunctive might sound like no bebáis ese vino. In Spain, no bebáis ese vino. In Latin America, no beban ese vino. Okay? So you have the difference between vosotros and ustedes and the corresponding forms when you're talking about the second person plural, you all or you guys. Alright. Likewise, in many Latin American dialects, voseo is also common. Now, voseo is the substitution of the pronoun vos and its verb forms for the standard second person familiar pronoun tú. The use of voseo is especially prominent in the River Plate dialect of Buenos Aires and Montevideo, but it also occurs in Central America and parts of several other South American countries. Voseo forms and usage vary somewhat from country to country, as you can see on this chart that shows its use in Central America, Argentina, and Chile. So you can see the pink area shows a lot of overlap between the sort of standard vos forms used in Central America and the voseo of Argentina, where they would say vos hablas, vos comes, vos escribís, vos sos. One difference between the Chilean vos is that instead of the pronoun vos, they do sometimes use the pronoun tú. So instead of vos hablas, or vos hablai, I should say, vos hablai, the S is not always pronounced vos hablai, they might say tú hablai. In fact, tú hablai is slightly more polite than vos hablai, which can sound provocative. Vos comí, vos escribí, vos soy, vos herí. Those are sort of rude and provocative terms in Chilean Spanish, but using the to form is more common. And you can see differences in the imperative or the command form. In standard voceo, you would have habla, come, escribí, where in Chile they would use these standard command forms, habla, come, escribe. But you see differences again in the negative command forms, the negative imperative, which use the subjunctive. In Central America, sort of the standard vos conjugation, they would stick with that and say, vos hables, no comas, no escribas. Whereas in Argentina, they might say that. You would occasionally hear that, but they often use the standard subjunctive for negative commands. No hables, no comas, no escribas. Whereas in Chile, they're back to their very different system. No hablé, no comas, no comai, no escribáis. No hablé, no comai, no escribáis. So those are examples of how the vos form can vary. Another example of grammatical, in this case morphological, variation. Okay. And here are some examples, some more examples of voceo usage, right? In standard Spanish, non-voceo, tú hablas español. In the River Plate variety, vos hablas español. In Chilean Spanish, either tú o vos habláis español. Comes en casa, standard Spanish, comes en casa, River Plate. Comí en casa in Chile, right? Eres peruano, tú eres peruano in standard Spanish. Sos peruano in the River Plate variety, or soy peruano in Chilean, eres peruano, okay? Those are some differences there. What about syntactic differences, such as the ordering of words and phrases? Well, one example of a regional syntactic difference is the tendency of some speakers of Caribbean Spanish, primarily in Cuba, to alter the standard interrogative, verb, subject order of questions. So, whereas in standard Spanish, questions beginning with interrogative words like que, cuando, and donde place the subject after the verb or suppress it entirely, many Cuban speakers place their subject before the verb form. So you would see, for example, in standard Spanish, ¿Dónde vives? But in Cuba you might hear, ¿Dónde tú vives? Instead of ¿Cómo están? Or ¿Cómo están ellos? In Cuba you might hear, ¿Cómo ellos están? Or instead of the standard Spanish, ¿Qué quieres? Or ¿Qué quieres tú? In Cuba you might hear, ¿Qué tú quieres? ¿Qué tú quieres? Putting the tú before the form quieres. Now finally, there are of course many differences in the words used in different dialects throughout Spain and Latin America. The same thing can be referred to by different names in different places due to preferences that have evolved over time, the incorporation of indigenous terms, or the influence of English and other languages. So here are just a few examples you can see on the chart of vocabulary terms that differ from region to region. You can see, for example, the word for apartment, right? In Spain, piso, Argentina, apartamento, in Mexico, departamento. The word for swimming pool, for example, piscina in Spain, pileta in Argentina, alberca in Mexico, and again, piscina in Puerto Rico. And then a strange example, right? The word for beans in Spain, judías, in Argentina, porotos, in Mexico, frijoles, as you all probably know, and in Puerto Rico, habichuelas. So again, that's just one example of vocabulary or semantic differences among these varieties. Alright, those have been some of the key characteristics of and distinctions between the regional varieties in Spain and Latin America. It's just a quick overview, of course, not even an attempt to be exhaustive in terms of those dialectical differences and characteristics. But hopefully you found something useful in this video, if only the realization that the dialects of Spanish are different, not inherently superior or inferior, and that we can all get along and respect those differences in our Spanish and Portuguese. So, until next time, this has been Professor Jason, and I look forward to your comments and discussion of this video. Até logo, hasta luego, ciao.